The scars across his chest were supposed to be proof of failure. A soldier too broken to matter, too weak to keep his rank. That's what the garrison believed, laughing as his tunic tore in the morning sun. What they didn't know was that those same scars marked the sole survivor of a massacre no one was ever meant to walk away from. A slaughter engineered from the inside, sold to the enemy by the very men sworn to protect him. Somewhere in that garrison, a traitor still wore an officer's uniform, and the general everyone feared was the only one who suspected the truth. Why would a decorated captain risk everything to bury one broken recruit's past? Stay with us, because the answer changes everything you think you know about him. Pour yourself something warm, settle in, and let us walk you through the story of William Farrow, the field medic who tumbled straight into an Alpha General's private bath and somehow tumbled straight into his heart instead. If you've ever been judged for a scar, a mistake, or a story people never bothered to ask about, tell us in the comments. We promise you're in very good company here. The rooster at Falkenstein Garrison was, by unanimous soldier consensus, either broken or malicious. It crowed at 4:30, which meant William Farrow was already late by the time he untangled himself from his cot, because he had spent the last hour before dawn stitching a gash in a mule driver's forearm and had fallen asleep sitting up with a bloodied needle still between his fingers. Farrow, Robert Kessler's head, appeared round the barracks door, hair sticking up like a startled hedgehog. Musters in 10 minutes, and you're not even wearing boots on the correct feet. William looked down. He was, in fact, wearing his boots on the wrong feet. They're the same boot, he said, with the flat calm of a man who had once held a collapsing bridge under enemy fire and considered footwear a minor inconvenience by comparison. Boots don't have opinions about feet. Tell that to your blisters in an hour. Robert was already gone, footsteps clattering down the corridor. William swapped his boots, grudgingly conceding the point, grabbed his tunic, and ran. He should not have taken the shortcut through the East Passage. He knew this later, with the clarity of hindsight. But the East Passage was faster, and faster meant the difference between merely late and flogged for insubordination. And so he barreled through a low stone archway, past a door he did not recognize, into a room full of steam. It was the bathhouse, not the recruit's bathhouse, which smelled perpetually of wet wool and regret. A different bathhouse, smaller, private, with actual soap that didn't smell like tallow and lye. William realized his error roughly 1 second after the door swung shut behind him, and roughly 2 seconds before his foot met a puddle of water on the tile and betrayed him completely. He went down like a felled tree, his arms pinwheeled. His hand caught the edge of a wooden basin stand, which did not so much break his fall as redirect its trajectory, and he landed, spectacularly, comprehensively, in the arms of the room's sole occupant, who had been standing waist-deep in the bath, entirely undressed, entirely unimpressed, and entirely enormous. There was a beat of silence broken only by dripping water. William found himself staring directly into a pair of storm-gray eyes set in a face carved from granite and bad temper. Water sluiced down a chest that looked less like a torso and more like a topographical map of a mountain range. He became aware with mounting horror that his hand was pressed flat against that chest, and that the man's arm had caught him instinctively around the waist, and that they were both at this moment extremely wet. "I can explain," William said. "I am extremely interested," said General Charles Voss, in the voice of a man who was not interested at all, "in how a recruit ends up in my private bath at 5 in the morning, General Voss." Of course it was the general. William's luck had never once in 24 years chosen the boring option. "Wrong door," William said, with the dignity of a man who had already accepted his own execution. "I took a wrong door. You took several wrong doors. This room requires passing 3 correct ones and 1 locked one. The locked one was not locked. It will be in future." Voss set him down, not ungently, William noted, somewhere beneath his panic, on dry stone, and reached for a towel with the unhurried calm of a man for whom nothing in the world was ever an emergency. "Name?" "William Farrow, sir." He was already backing toward the door, dripping, mortified, one boot squelching. "Field medic, reassigned to combat drills, as of this week." I'll see myself out." Farrow, the general said it like he was filing it away somewhere permanent. His eyes had done something William chose not to examine too closely. A flicker, quick as a blade, down and back up. "Muster is in 8 minutes. I'd suggest finding the correct door this time." William found it. He also found, upon arriving at the yard, soaked to the collarbone and short of breath, that news of a recruit's spectacular misadventure travels faster than the recruit himself, and that 200 men could in fact all snicker at the exact same moment with terrifying synchronicity. "You fell into the general's bath?" Robert whispered, delighted, as they fell into formation. "I did not fall into it. I fell toward it, and was arrested mid-descent by an extremely startled general." "Arrested by his arms, you mean?" "Robert, I'm just saying, most men would pay good coin for that particular." "Robert." The formation snapped to silence as General Voss strode out onto the yard, fully dressed now, dry, composed, as though the last 10 minutes had never happened, save for the single unreadable glance he cast down the line and let land very briefly on William. William did not blush. He was a professional. He had held a man's intestines in place with his bare hands during the retreat from the Falkenstein Pass. He was above blushing. He blushed anyway. Falkenstein Garrison sat on a shoulder of granite above the town of Rothenburg, close enough to the Black Forest that the wind carried pine and wood smoke even in high summer, close enough to the mountains that on clear mornings the recruits could see the pale teeth of the Alps far to the south. It was the westernmost stronghold of the Duchy of Lorenvale, and it had, until 3 months ago, been a quiet posting, the kind of garrison where old soldiers went to finish their service in peace. Then General Charles Voss had arrived, and quiet had left with the last commander. He was, by every account William gathered over his first week, an alpha of the old northern bloodline, the kind that could still, on the full moon, shed skin for fur and run the ridgeline as a wolf pale as fresh snow. The soldiers spoke of him the way men speak of weather systems, with respect, wariness, and no expectation of being consulted. William kept his head down. He had reasons to keep his head down that had nothing to do with boots or bathhouses, reasons written in raised silver-pink lines across his ribs and shoulder, the map of a night 18 months ago that he did not discuss, not with Robert, not with the garrison physician, not with anyone. He might have kept keeping his head down indefinitely, had the armor inspection not happened. It was a Tuesday. William remembered because Tuesdays were laundry days, and his spare tunic was still damp, and so he wore his second-best one, the one with a seam along the left shoulder that had never quite held. The seam gave out precisely as Sergeant Beck grabbed his collar to inspect his posture, precisely in front of the entire second company, precisely in front of General Voss, who had chosen that morning, of all mornings, to observe drills in person. The fabric tore from collar to elbow. William's shoulder and half his chest came into view in the flat gray morning light, and with it the scars, raised, twisting, unmistakable, the kind of wound only black fire ordnance left behind, the kind every veteran of the border wars recognized on sight. The yard went very quiet, and then it did not. "Would you look at that?" said a recruit near the back. Aldrich's man, one of the new nobleman's son transfers, a sneer already halfway to his mouth. Thought Farrow just stitched up other men's wounds. Didn't know he collected his own. Laughter, the ugly kind, rippled through the ranks. William stood very still, the way he had learned to stand still under far worse things than laughter, and said nothing because there was nothing to say that these men would understand, and because explaining would mean speaking of the pass, and he did not speak of the pass. Silence. The word did not need to be shouted. Voss's voice cut through the yard like a blade drawn from its sheath, and 200 men found their spines all at once. He crossed the yard himself, not sending a lieutenant, not calling William forward, but walking the distance in long, unhurried strides until he stood directly in front of him, close enough that William had to tip his chin up to hold his gaze, close enough to smell rain and cedar and the low-banked heat of an alpha's temper barely leashed. "Cadet." Voss did not look at the recruit who had spoken. He looked at William, and something in his face had gone very carefully, very deliberately blank, the look of a man deciding in real time not to do something he wanted to do. "Report to the armory. Draw a new tunic. That is an order, not a suggestion." Then at last he turned toward the ranks, and the temperature of the yard seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Black fire scarring," Voss said in a voice pitched to carry to the back row, "comes from precisely one source in this duchy's living memory. The border ordnance our own enemies use against soldiers who do not run. I have seen it exactly twice in my career, once on a corpse. Once, his eyes flicked, one bare second, back to William, on a man still breathing, still standing, still in my formation. You will not laugh at a survivor's scars in my yard again." The next man who does will explain himself to me personally, and I promise you, gentlemen, that conversation will be considerably less pleasant than this one." No one laughed again. Not that day, not for a long time after. William changed his tunic in silence, hands not quite steady, and told himself it meant nothing. A general defending discipline, nothing more, certainly not a man defending him. And did not entirely believe it, and did not know, yet, what to do with the small, stubborn warmth that had lodged itself under his ribs, where the old scars ached. That night, a knock came at the medical bay door well past curfew. William opened it to find the general himself, out of uniform, a jar of salve in one large hand. "Kessler mentioned your seam's not the only thing you neglect to repair," Voss said, which was, William would learn. "As close as the man came to, I was worried about you. This is better than whatever the garrison stocks." For scars that ache in cold weather, William took the jar. Their fingers brushed, barely, a fraction of a second, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with medicine at all. "Thank you, sir," he said, and meant several things by it. "Charles," Voss said, already turning to go, as though the correction cost him something to offer. "When it's just this—" He was gone before William could answer, boots receding down the stone corridor, leaving William standing in the doorway with a jar of salve going warm in his hands and the distinct, alarming sensation that the ground beneath his life had just shifted half a degree, permanently, off its old axis. If William had hoped the bathhouse incident and the scar incident would be the sum total of his humiliations that season, the universe disagreed and delivered its rebuttal in the form of Daniel Aldrich. Daniel was the son of a border count, tall and golden and entirely too aware of both facts, transferred to Falkenstein for seasoning, which, as far as William could tell, meant learning which forks to use while other men did the actual soldiering. He had also, within his first week, decided that William Farrow was interesting, in the particular way noble sons decided things were interesting, as a diversion, a project, a small conquest to relieve the boredom of provincial posting. "You patched my hand rather beautifully last week," Daniel said, appearing at William's elbow in the mess hall with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no and meant it. "I've been meaning to properly thank you. Dinner, perhaps. There's a passable inn in Rothenburg. The infirmary doesn't take reservations for gratitude," William said, not looking up from his stew. "You're welcome. That's the whole transaction. You're prickly." "I like prickly." Daniel leaned closer, entirely too pleased with himself, and that was the precise moment General Voss chose to walk past the table, carrying nothing more incriminating than a stack of requisition forms. He did not stop. He did not say anything. He simply walked past at a pace that suggested a man very deliberately not breaking a table in half, and the temperature of the mess hall dropped noticeably enough that Robert, 3 seats down, choked on his bread. "Was that," Robert whispered once Voss was out of earshot, eyes enormous, "a jealous general I just witnessed? That was a general walking to his office. That was a general walking to his office, like his office had personally insulted his mother." Robert grinned into his stew. "Farrow, you beautiful disaster. You've got the Alpha General of Falkenstein Garrisons sniffing around like a dog at a butcher's window, and you're going to sit there and tell me it's nothing." "It's absolutely nothing," William said, with the total conviction of a man who had, in fact, lain awake 3 nights running, turning a small jar of salve over in his hands like it was a love letter. The proof arrived 2 days later, in the training yard, when Daniel, apparently undeterred and possibly encouraged by William's continued prickliness, which some men mistook for coyness, made the tactical error of cornering William by the stables to press his case a second time. One hand braced against the wall beside William's head in a manner clearly borrowed from a romance novel Daniel had definitely read. "One dinner," Daniel said. "I'm quite charming once you get past the initial." "Aldrich." The voice came from directly behind him, low and even and considerably more dangerous for its calm. "The east fence line needs mending before nightfall. You'll take the detail." Daniel turned, visibly startled, to find General Voss standing close enough that his shadow fell entirely over both of them. "Sir, I wasn't aware fence mending was." "It is now." Voss did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Something in the set of his shoulders, the faint gold flare at the edge of his eyes that spoke of an alpha's temper, riding very close to the surface, did the work instead. "Take 3 men. Take the rest of the afternoon. Take your charm." The word came out with a precision that could cut glass. "Somewhere it will be better appreciated." Daniel left. Quickly, William stood very still, arms crossed, fighting and losing, the urge to smile. "You didn't have to do that," he said, once they were alone, the stable's shadow long and cool around them. "I know." Voss did not look remotely apologetic. If anything, he looked faintly, uncharacteristically flustered, a general caught in an act he had not entirely planned. "The fence does need mending." Charles. It was the first time William had used the name to his face, deliberately, testing the shape of it. Voss's expression did something complicated and unguarded, there and gone in an instant, like a door left open half a second too long. "He has no right to corner you," Voss said, quieter now, all the command drained out of his voice, and something rawer left in its place. "You've had enough men decide what you're for without your consent, Farrow." "I won't have another," William's breath caught. He thought, absurdly, of the pass, of being talked about, talked over, decided upon by men who never once asked what he wanted, and here was this enormous, terrifying, gentle man, drawing a line around him not to possess him but to give the choice back. "And what do you want?" William asked before he could stop himself. "From me?" Voss was quiet a long moment. The stable smelled of hay and horse and warm leather, and somewhere above them a wood pigeon complained about the heat. "I'd like," he said finally, carefully, like a man setting down something fragile, "to be given the chance to earn an answer to that question, rather than assume I already have the right to one." It was, William would think later, an absurdly gallant thing for a man built like a siege engine to say. He said nothing aloud. He simply reached out, surprising himself as much as Voss, and let his fingers rest, briefly, against the back of the general's hand. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then a stable boy rounded the corner leading a horse, and the moment folded itself neatly away, tucked into the growing collection of things. Neither of them had said out loud yet, but both of them now knew. It became, over the following weeks, an open secret that the general and the field medic had an understanding, though neither of them had said the word aloud that would make it official. It showed in smaller things. The way Voss found reasons to walk the infirmary corridor at hours that had nothing to do with duty rosters. The way William began leaving a second cup out when he brewed the bitter mountain tea he liked, without quite admitting to himself who the cup was for. It showed most memorably in the incident with the goat. The garrison kept a small herd for milk, tended by an elderly quartermaster named Old Brant, and one particularly ambitious goat had developed a habit of escaping its pen to terrorize the laundry lines. William, summoned to treat a recruit's minor goat-related injury, a nip, nothing more, though the recruit in question wailed as though mortally wounded, arrived at the laundry yard to find General Voss, commander of the Falkenstein Wolf Guard, decorated veteran of 3 border campaigns, terror of 200 recruits, attempting, with grim determination and 0 success, to coax the goat down from atop a supply cart using a carrot and the low, coaxing voice he otherwise reserved for calming spooked horses. William stood in the archway and watched for a full minute before announcing his presence, because some things deserved to be savored. "I could use," Voss said, without turning around, somehow entirely aware of him anyway, considerably less amusement and considerably more assistance. "You could use a rope," William said, "or you could simply command it. You're an alpha." "Command the goat." "The goat," Voss said, with the flat exhaustion of a man who had clearly already tried this, "does not recognize rank. Scandalous. Someone should discipline it. Farrow, sir. If you do not help me capture this animal in the next 30 seconds, I will assign you to permanent laundry duty for the remainder of the season." William laughed, a real laugh, startled out of him, the kind he hadn't produced in longer than he cared to count, and crossed the yard, and between the two of them, William providing the actual strategy, Voss providing the actual muscle, the goat providing chaos in equal measure to both, they cornered the beast against the well and returned it, indignant and bleeding, to its pen. They stood afterward, breathing hard, faintly ridiculous, both of them dusted in hay and goat hair, and Voss looked at him with an expression William had not yet learned to name. Something soft around the eyes, something that made the scars along William's ribs feel, for the first time in 18 months, less like a wound, and more like simply a part of him that had survived to be looked at this way. "You're smiling," Voss said, sounding faintly amazed by the fact. "You're covered in goat." "That is not what I said. It's what I'm choosing to respond to." Voss reached out, slowly, giving him every chance to step back, which William did not take. and brushed a stray piece of straw from William's hair, with a gentleness that seemed entirely disproportionate to a hand that could, William knew, put a blade through a man's ribs without flinching. "I find," Voss said quietly, "that I would very much like to keep making you smile like that, if you'll let me." "I believe," William said, and his voice was not quite steady. "I've been letting you for weeks, General. You've simply been too polite to notice you'd already won." Voss kissed him then, soft, questioning, the kind of first kiss that asks rather than takes, and William answered it with both hands fisted in the front of the general's tunic, hay and goat and laundry lines and all, and neither of them cared in the slightest that old Brant was watching from the shed with an expression of profound, unsurprised satisfaction. "About damned time," the old man muttered, and went back to his milking. The trouble, when it came, arrived wearing the uniform of Captain Reinhard Kroll, a broad, weathered officer who had served at Falkenstein longer than anyone save old Brant, and who had watched the new general's rapid rise and the new medic's rapid rise alongside him, with an interest that curdled, over weeks, into something far uglier than jealousy. William noticed it first as small things, requisition orders for the infirmary going missing, a rumor, traced back to no one in particular, suggesting the field medic from nowhere had forged his own service record. He mentioned it to Voss over a shared pot of tea in the general's quarters, more irritated than alarmed. "Kroll's been quartermaster of this garrison for 11 years, Voss said, frowning into his cup. He answered directly to the last commander, and profited handsomely doing it, if the ledgers I've been auditing are any indication. A new general asking questions is bad for men who like the old answers. You think he's skimming supplies. I think, Voss said, that skimming supplies from a border garrison, during a season when our enemies across the Rhine have been probing our defenses with unusual persistence, is one short step from something considerably worse than theft." He was right, and the proof arrived 3 nights later in the worst possible way. A raid on the garrison's own armory, timed for the night watch Kroll himself had scheduled, executed by men in Lorenvale uniforms who were, upon capture, revealed to be nothing of the sort, mercenaries in the pay of the same enemy forces William had once faced at the pass, moving Blackfire ordnance out through a corrupted garrison under cover of a captain's own authority. William was not meant to be involved. He was the medic. His war was fought with needle and salve, not blade. But when the alarm bell tore through the night and he saw, through the infirmary window, the telltale sickly green shimmer of Blackfire charges being loaded onto a supply wagon at the garrison's rear gate, the exact weapon that had carved the scars into his own chest 18 months ago, something in him that had been quiet for a very long time stood up and would not sit back down. He grabbed the only blade in the infirmary, a surgical one, absurdly, but a blade was a blade, and ran. He reached the rear gate in time to see Kroll himself, sword drawn, standing between Voss and the mercenaries' escape route, and in time to hear the captain say, with the particular venom of a man who has decided honesty no longer costs him anything, "You should have stayed a quiet postings, General Voss. Men who ask too many questions about old arrangements tend to find themselves overrun by enemy raiders in the night. It happened to your predecessor's ledger keeper. It will happen to you." "You sold border ordnance to the men who did this," Voss said, low and lethal, and William understood with a cold drop of his stomach that the general was not looking at Kroll at all in that moment. He was looking past him at William, standing in the gateway with a surgical blade and old scars and a face gone white with recognition. "To the men who nearly killed him. He's a stray medic from a slaughtered unit no one remembers," Kroll spat. "One casualty more or less changes nothing." It was, William would reflect afterward, an extraordinarily foolish thing to say to an Alpha General in front of the Omega he had by that point fallen entirely and helplessly in love with. Voss moved like the wolf whose blood ran in him, fast and low and utterly without mercy, and the fight that followed was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided. William, for his part, did not stand idle. A mercenary lunging for the gate found a surgical blade buried in his forearm with the precision of a man who had spent years finding exactly where a body could be stopped without being killed, and William Farrow discovered, with some surprise, that he was not nearly so helpless as 18 months of quiet hiding had convinced him he was. By the time the garrison guard arrived in force, Kroll was in irons, the mercenaries were scattered or captured, and Voss stood in the gateway breathing hard, blood on his knuckles that was not his own, staring at William with an expression that mixed fury, terror, and a fierce and helpless pride so thoroughly that William could not tell where one ended and the next began. "You could have died," Voss said, voice rough. "So could you," William said. "I decided I preferred neither of those outcomes, so I came to prevent both." Voss crossed the distance between them and pulled him in, not gently, not carefully, but with the desperate thoroughness of a man confirming with his own hands that the person he loved was still breathing. And William let himself be held, scars and blade, and 18 months of silence and all, and thought, quite clearly, oh, this is what safety is supposed to feel like. The dust of the conspiracy settled within a week. Imperial investigators, dispatched from the capital at Grand Duke Leopold's own order, once Voss's report reached him, confirmed everything the garrison had feared and more. Kroll had been selling border ordnance and troop movements to enemy agents for the better part of 3 years, and, in a detail that made William's hands go cold when he heard it, the unit slaughtered at the Falkenstein Pass 18 months earlier had not fallen to enemy strength alone. Kroll's predecessor in the smuggling arrangement had sold their position, their numbers, their exact hour of patrol to the very forces that ambushed them. William had not been the sole survivor of bad luck. He had been the sole survivor of betrayal, the only one of 40 men to walk away from a slaughter engineered by his own side, and he had spent 18 months believing it was simply a battle he alone had been strong enough to endure. The truth, when the Grand Duke's decree restored his name and rank, Captain Farrow now, reinstated with full honors, his record scrubbed of the quiet suspicion that had followed the lone survivor for a year and a half, did not erase the scars. It did something better. It gave them meaning that was not shame. Voss stood beside him on the day of the announcement, in the same yard where a torn seam had once exposed William to ridicule, and this time when 200 recruits looked at the scars visible above his new captain's collar. They did not laugh. They saluted. "Captain Farrow," Voss said formally in front of the assembled garrison, and then quieter, meant only for him, "Report to my quarters at 8 bells. We have a rather important matter of strategy to discuss." "Is that what we're calling it now?" William murmured. "It is precisely what we are calling it," Voss said, entirely straight-faced, in front of 200 witnesses. The general's private quarters smelled of cedar and an old parchment and the low, banked warmth of a hearth fire, and when William arrived at 8 bells precisely, because he had learned, over these past weeks, that punctuality mattered to Charles Voss almost as much as honesty did, he found 2 glasses of wine already poured and waiting. "You called for me, General," William said, mostly to see the muscle jump in Voss's jaw at the title. "Drop it," Voss said, exactly as predicted. "We're alone." William crossed the room without hesitation, no hovering by the door, no waiting to be invited, the way the old William, the frightened field medic, hiding his scars beneath heavy wool even in high summer, might once have done. He walked straight to where Voss stood by the fire, and stopped close enough that the general had to look down to meet his eyes. "I have a confession," William said. "Should I be concerned? I fell into your bath on purpose." Voss went very still. "You did not." "I absolutely did not," William agreed, entirely unrepentant, "but I've been considering claiming that I did, because it makes for a much better story to tell our children someday, and I'd like to get ahead of the narrative before Kessler starts embellishing it for us." "Our children," Voss repeated, something raw and hopeful cracking through the careful composure he wore like armor. "A figure of speech," William said, more gently now, reaching up to rest his palm against the general's jaw, feeling the faint rasp of stubble beneath his fingers. "Unless you'd like it to be something else eventually. There's no rush. I've only just gotten my name back. I'd like to enjoy it a while before I go handing pieces of my life to someone else." "Take all the time you need," Voss said, turning his face into William's palm with a tenderness that undid something in William's chest more thoroughly than any blade had ever managed. "I've waited considerably longer for considerably less. I can wait a while more for this." "You don't have to wait for this part," William said, and closed the distance between them himself. The kiss was unhurried, deep, carrying the weight of every moment that had led here. The bathhouse, the torn seam, the goat, the gate, the blood and the fear, and the quiet, unbearable relief of being seen entirely and not found wanting. Voss's hand came up to cradle the back of William's skull with a care that belied its size, and William felt the low thrum of the bond between them. Not yet sealed, not yet marked, but present all the same, a warmth settling into place like a key finding its lock. They did not rush what came after. When, much later, Voss pressed his lips to the junction of William's throat and murmured a question rather than an assumption. "May I?" William answered with his whole chest, and the mark that followed was slow and reverent, and entirely unlike the violence that had once carved scars into the same skin. Where the black fire had left ruin, this left only warmth, a low golden hum that settled behind William's ribs and did not ache, that felt, for the first time since the pass, like his body was entirely and only his own to give. Morning came gray and gold through the shutters. William woke first, Voss's arm heavy and warm across his waist, the bond a quiet second heartbeat in his mind. Not loud, not demanding, simply there, the way a hearth fire is there on a cold night, asking nothing, giving everything. "We have to get up," William said, without any real intention of moving. "I know." Voss did not move either. "In a moment, the garrison will talk." "Let them." Voss pulled him closer, nose pressed into William's hair, entirely unbothered by the prospect of 200 soldiers discovering their general had in fact been thoroughly and permanently claimed by the field medic who once fell into his bath. "Let the whole duchy talk. Let them see exactly who I belong to." They rose eventually, dressed each other with more lingering than efficiency strictly required, and walked out onto the garrison's east balcony together as the sun cleared the ridgeline and turned the black forest gold at its edges. Below, the recruits were assembling for morning drills, and when they looked up and saw their general and their captain standing together, the mark plainly visible above William's collar, the silence that swept the yard was not the silence of scorn. It was the silence of 200 men understanding, all at once, that the story they'd whispered about all season, the mocked medic, the terrifying general, the wrong door in an east passage, had turned out to be, against every expectation, a love story after all. "Ready?" Voss asked, hand warm and solid on William's shoulder. "Always," William said, and meant it more completely than he had ever meant anything in his life. They stepped off the balcony together, into the sun, into the noise of drums and boots, and 200 soldiers falling into formation for a captain, who had once been mocked for the very scars that now caught the morning light like something worth looking at, worth honoring, worth loving. The ghosts of the Falkenstein Pass were quiet at last. The traitors were gone, and the path ahead for the first time in 18 months was not simply survival. It was home. 6 months later, Charles. William did not look up from the ledger he was balancing at the kitchen table of their small cottage on the garrison's eastern slope. "There is fur on the butter. There is not fur on the butter. There is considerable fur on the butter, and I would like you, as the responsible party, to explain how a man capable of commanding an entire wolf guard cannot manage to keep his own fur out of the dairy." There was a guilty pause from the direction of the hearth rug, where a very large white wolf had, until 30 seconds ago, been sprawled in the morning sun with the boneless satisfaction of a creature entirely convinced he had earned the rest. The wolf's ears flattened. The wolf did not notably deny the charge. "You could simply not shift indoors during shedding season," William said, setting down his pen. "This was covered in our very first conversation about cohabitation. I distinctly remember making a list." The wolf huffed, an oddly put-upon sound for an apex predator, and, in the space of a breath, resolved itself back into the considerably more presentable shape of General Charles Voss, currently retired from active garrison command in favor of a training advisory role that let him sleep in his own bed more nights than not, which he had informed William, with great seriousness, was the single greatest strategic victory of his career. "The list," Charles said, crossing the kitchen to press a kiss to the top of William's head, entirely unrepentant, specified the bedroom. It said nothing about the hearth rug. The list assumed a baseline of common sense that I now recognize was optimistic. "You married a baseline of common sense," Charles pointed out, settling into the chair across from him and stealing a piece of toast directly off William's plate with the shameless confidence of a man who knew he would not be stopped. "You cannot now be surprised when the baseline underperforms. I married a wolf who once got stuck attempting to fit through the pantry door because he refused, on principle, to shift back down before finishing an entire wheel of cheese. That cheese," Charles said with dignity, "was excellent, and I regret nothing. You got stuck for 40 minutes. I was reassessing my angle of approach. You were wedged between the flour barrel and the wall, howling, while Robert stood in the doorway, laughing so hard he had to sit down. Kessler, Charles said darkly, has never once let me forget it, and I hold you personally responsible for having married into a life where that man is now a permanent fixture at our dinner table twice a month. You promoted him to sergeant. That was entirely your doing, a mistake I revisit nightly. William laughed, that easy, unguarded laugh that still, 6 months into marriage, made something in Charles's chest go soft and helpless every single time he heard it, and reached across the table to steal his toast back, which Charles surrendered without a fight, because he had learned over the better part of a year that there was very little in this world he would not surrender for that particular sound. "There's a new recruit," William said, once breakfast had settled into its usual comfortable chaos, "asking after you at the garrison gate this morning. Young, terribly earnest. Kept asking if it was true the general of the Wolf Guard had married a man he'd once accidentally assaulted in his own bathtub." Charles closed his eyes with the long-suffering patience of a man who understood, finally and completely, that this particular piece of garrison folklore was never, under any circumstances, going to die. "It was not an assault, Farrow. You fell on me." That is precisely the story I told him, in exhaustive and entirely unflattering detail, because I am your husband, and it is my sacred duty to keep the legend alive. I regret every choice that led to this marriage. You do not. "I do not," Charles agreed, entirely too fondly, catching William's hand across the table and pressing a kiss to his knuckles, right over the place where old scar tissue met new, unbroken skin, both of them equally beloved, equally home. Not for one single moment of it. Outside, the black forest turned gold with early autumn. The garrison bells rang the hour, and somewhere in the yard below, a new recruit was undoubtedly hearing, for the very first time, the entirely true and thoroughly embellished story of how the terrifying general of Falkenstein had been won over, absolutely and forever, by a field medic who once took catastrophically wrong turn through the wrong door, and had never, not for one single day since, regretted following him through it. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to know which moment hit you the hardest. Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. A like and a subscribe genuinely fuels the next story we get to tell. So thank you for spending this time with us and with Mavis and Alaric's journey. The letter arrived on a morning thick with frost, carried by a rider whose horse had clearly been pushed hard through the mountain passes. William was elbow-deep in the pantry, attempting to locate a jar of quince preserves that Charles swore he had not eaten, when Robert Kessler's voice came hollering up the garden path. "Farrow, Farrow, there's a seal on this thing the size of a dinner plate." William wiped his hands on his apron and came to the door to find Robert holding the letter at arm's length as though it might bite him, which, given the wax stamped across its fold, the twin wolves of House Lorenvale, crossed beneath a ducal crown, was not an entirely unreasonable instinct. "That's the Grand Duke's own seal," Robert said, "not the Chancellery's, his, personal." Charles came in from the yard at the sound of raised voices, still in his shirt sleeves, sawdust on his forearms from mending the fence he had been putting off for a week. He took the letter, broke the seal with his thumb, and read it in the particular silence he reserved for things that mattered. "We're summoned," he said finally, "to the autumn accord." William had heard of the accord the way one hears of distant weather, a fact of court life that had never once touched his own. Once a year, the nobility and ranking officers of every garrison in Lorenvale gathered at the capital to renew oaths, settle border disputes, and remind one another, over unnecessary quantities of wine, exactly whose family had done what to whose family 3 generations back. It was, by every account William had gathered, equal parts diplomacy and blood sport. "Why would he summon us specifically?" William asked. "Surely garrison commanders attend every year without a personal seal." "They do." Charles's jaw had gone tight in the way it did when he was choosing his words with unusual care. But this year, the Duke wishes to personally receive the man who exposed a smuggling ring that had been bleeding border ordnance to the enemy for 3 years. "And," he added, folding the letter with more force than strictly necessary, "he wishes to meet my husband." The word still did something to William's chest every time Charles said it aloud, 6 months of marriage notwithstanding. He suspected it always would. "That sounds considerably less like an honor," William said slowly. and considerably more like a court full of nobles deciding whether to approve of me. Yes, Charles admitted. That is precisely what it sounds like. Wonderful, William said, and went back to hunting for the quince preserves, because if he was going to be examined like a prize horse in front of the assembled aristocracy of Lorenvale, he intended to at least have breakfast first. They traveled for 6 days, the garrison escort trailing behind at a respectful distance, and William spent most of the journey learning things about his husband that 6 months of marriage in a quiet mountain posting had never required. He learned, for instance, that Charles Voss, terror of 200 recruits, alpha of an old and feared bloodline, was, on long carriage rides, prone to a restlessness that had nothing to do with temper and everything to do with a wolf's constitutional objection to sitting still. You could simply run alongside the carriage, William suggested, on the 3rd day, watching Charles fold himself uncomfortably into a corner of the bench for the 4th time in an hour. That would alarm the horses. The horses seem entirely unbothered by the fact that they are at present hauling a man who periodically becomes an enormous wolf. They are Lorenvale carriage horses. They are bred for discretion. Charles cracked one eye open. Also, I do not wish to arrive at court smelling of the road. You will smell of the road regardless. We are on a road. There is a considerable difference, Farrow, between the smell of travel and the smell of having run 12 miles as a wolf, and I would ask you not to conflate the two in front of the Grand Duke. William laughed. The easy, unguarded laugh that Charles Stills, 6 months in, seemed to chase the way other men chased fortune, and let his head rest against Charles's shoulder, and did not think, for a good long while, about court or nobles, or the particular exhaustion of being examined. He thought about it again, considerably, the moment the capital's spires came into view over the last ridge. Lorenvale City sprawled along the river in a way Falkenstein's granite shoulder never had. Wide avenues, taller buildings, banners in half a dozen house colors snapping in the wind above rooftops. William, who had spent the better part of his adult life in garrisons and field hospitals, found himself gripping the edge of the carriage window with something perilously close to nerves. You held a collapsing bridge under enemy fire, Charles said quietly, watching him. You are not permitted to be frightened of a dinner party. A dinner party did not once try to bury me under several tons of stone. No, Charles agreed, but I promise you, some of the guests will try considerably harder. The Grand Duke's hall was everything William had expected and dreaded in equal measure. Vaulted ceilings, 100 candles, nobility arranged by rank and bloodline in a room designed to make anyone without both feel precisely as small as intended. Grand Duke Leopold himself was not what William had pictured. He was an older man, silver-templed, with tired eyes and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades listening to people lie to him and had grown skilled at telling the difference. Captain Farrow. The Duke's voice carried, deliberately, to the corners of the hall. I am told you walked into a den of smugglers with a surgical blade and considerably more nerve than sense, and came out the other side having saved my general's life and my duchy's border stores in the same evening. I came out the other side terrified, Your Grace, William said before he could stop himself, but I understand terrified and reckless often look identical from the outside. A ripple of laughter moved through the hall, genuine, William thought, not mocking, and he saw, from the corner of his eye, Charles's mouth twitch with poorly suppressed pride. I like him, the Duke said, to no one in particular, and then, more quietly, to Charles. You did well, General, both in exposing Kroll and in choosing your captain. Lorenvale needs more men who tell the truth even when it costs them the room's good opinion. It might have ended there. A pleasant evening, a quiet vindication, had Count Aldrich not chosen that exact moment to approach, golden and smiling and every inch his son's father, with the particular condescension of a man who had never once had to earn anything he possessed. General Voss. The Count's bow was a fraction too shallow to be entirely respectful, and this must be the famous field medic. Daniel has told me so much about your garrison's unconventional arrangements. Count Aldrich. Charles's voice had gone very level, very careful, the tone William now recognized as the one just before a storm. I trust your son's fence-mending skills improved. He mentioned that as well. The Count's smile did not reach his eyes. Tell me, Captain, a common soldier, elevated to captain and married into a bloodline as old as the Voss line, all within 18 months. Some in this hall are calling it a fairy tale. Others are calling it rather convenient timing, given the scandal you so fortuitously uncovered. The hall's noise did not stop exactly, but it thinned, several dozen conversations pausing mid-word to listen. William felt the old, familiar instinct rise in him, the urge to go quiet, to let the accusation sit unanswered, the way he had once let 200 soldiers laugh at his scars without argument. He had spent 18 months believing silence was safety. He did not choose silence this time. "I uncovered nothing fortuitous, Count Aldrich," William said, and was faintly, distantly pleased to hear his own voice come out steady. "I recognized Blackfire Ordnance because it once carved 8 scars into my chest and killed 39 men I called brothers. I did not need convenient timing to know what that weapon looked like, moving through a supply gate at midnight. I needed 18 months of nightmares, which I would not wish on you, but which I do not regret having, because they are the reason Captain Kroll is currently in irons, instead of continuing to sell your border's safety to the men who nearly killed me." The silence that followed was absolute. As for the marriage, William continued, before the Count could recover, "I did not marry a bloodline, Count Aldrich. I married a man who once spent 40 minutes wedged in a pantry doorway rather than abandon a wheel of cheese, and who once negotiated, unsuccessfully, with a goat. I am aware the Voss name carries considerable weight in this hall. I assure you it carried none whatsoever in the moment he decided to love me, which is, I think, rather the point of the thing." The Grand Duke laughed first, a genuine, delighted bark of a sound that broke whatever tension had gathered in the room, and the hall followed his lead, and Count Aldrich, finding himself with considerably less ground to stand on than he had arrived with, offered a stiff bow and retreated toward the wine table with the air of a man recalculating several assumptions at once. "Well," Charles murmured, close to William's ear, warm with something that was not quite laughter and not quite pride, but sat very near both, "I believe you have just won the entire accord in a single speech. I believe I have just made a permanent enemy of the Aldrich family. You made that enemy in a stable 6 months ago, Farrow. Tonight you simply informed the rest of the hall. They did not stay for the full length of the evening's festivities." Charles found William an hour later on a balcony overlooking the river, having escaped the crush of well-wishers and the considerably less pleasant company of nobles still recalculating their opinions, and found him not shaken, as he had half expected, but simply tired in the particular way that came after holding one's ground. "You did not have to defend yourself so thoroughly," Charles said, coming to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "I know." William watched the river catch the lantern light from the palace windows, gold and rippling. "I spent 18 months letting other men decide what my scars meant. I've decided I'm rather done with that particular habit." "Good." Charles's hand found his, fingers lacing together over the balcony rail. "I married a man capable of holding a bridge under fire. I confess I forget, sometimes, in the quiet of our kitchen and the business of fences and goats, that the same man is also capable of dismantling a count in front of an entire ducal court. Are you frightened of me now?" "Terribly," Charles said, entirely unconvincingly, and drew him in against his chest, chin resting atop William's head, the low-banked warmth of him a familiar and welcome thing after a night spent surrounded by strangers, measuring him for weaknesses. "I find I do not mind it in the slightest." They stood like that a long while, the capital's noise distant and muffled behind them, the river running dark and silver below, and William thought, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, that whatever the court of Lorenvale decided to make of their marriage, he had already gotten the only verdict that mattered. They left the capital 3 days later, the Grand Duke's personal thanks, and, more usefully, a formal writ confirming William's captaincy beyond any court's ability to later dispute it, tucked safely among their traveling papers. Robert met them at the garrison gate, practically vibrating with the effort of having heard 4 separate, increasingly embellished versions of the Aldrich confrontation before they had even crossed the ridge. "They're saying," Robert announced, falling into step beside the carriage as it rolled through the gate, "that you called the Count a coward in front of the entire ducal hall and then challenged him to a duel." "I did not challenge anyone to a duel. The version I heard had swords involved." "There were no swords, Robert. There was a speech about a goat." "The version where there are swords is better," Robert said, entirely unrepentant, "and I intend to keep telling that one." Old Brant, when they reached the cottage on the eastern slope, greeted them with rather less enthusiasm and rather more practicality, having spent the week feeding a wolf-sized dent in the pantry's cheese supply to an increasingly guilty-looking hound that Charles swore up and down was not, in fact, secretly himself. "That is Bruno's doing," Charles said, with great dignity, regarding the empty cheese shelf. "Bruno," William said, "is a farm dog who has never once, in his life, shown any interest in anything more sophisticated than mud. Bruno has hidden depths." "Bruno," William said, setting down their travel bags, "is currently asleep by the hearth and has been the entire time we've been standing here arguing about him, which I feel rather undermines your case." Charles had the grace, at least, to look faintly sheepish, and William, tired from the road, warm with the particular relief of having come home, decided the matter of the missing cheese could wait until morning, and drew his husband in for a kiss that tasted of mountain air and quiet victory and 6 days of missing this exact small kitchen, in this exact small cottage, on this exact eastern slope where the whole of Lorenvale's court intrigue felt, blessedly, a very long way away. The garrison rooster, against all reasonable expectation, was still either broken or malicious, and still crowed at 4:30, and William Farrow, captain of the Wolf Guards Medical Corps, formally confirmed by ducal writ, husband to General Charles Voss for a year and 2 months, as of this particular frostbright morning, had, at long last, learned to sleep through it entirely. It was Charles who woke first, as he often did, nose pressed into William's hair, and Charles who noticed, before William himself between them, settling into something new and different that morning, quieter in one register, louder in another, the way a hearth fire shifts when new wood catches. "Farrow," he said slowly, sitting up, "something's changed." William said, not yet awake enough for coherent conversation. "The bond." "It's—" Charles stopped, searching for words a lifetime of soldiering had never required of him. "It feels like there's someone new listening." William sat up properly then, and understood, in the same instant Charles did, exactly what a bonded Alpha's instincts had noticed before either of them had dared to hope for it, and the two of them sat in their small bed in their small cottage on the eastern slope, hands clasped together over the quiet, golden, entirely new thing that had settled itself between them overnight, and said nothing at all for a long, long moment, because some things did not yet have words, and did not need them. Outside, the rooster crowed again, and the black forest turned gold with a second autumn, and down in the yard the new recruits were falling into formation, none of them yet aware that the story they would tell for years to come. The rondeur, the goat, the Count's ill-fated challenge, and now this, whatever this was going to become, had not finished being written after all. It had only just begun its next chapter. If this continuation gave you what you were hoping for, let us know which moment you loved most. We read every comment, and it's what keeps us coming back to Charles and William's story.